In 2024, a woman in Los Angeles filed 3 restraining orders against the same man. The man was the most feared crime boss on the West Coast. He framed all 3, had them custom lit, made his new recruits bow to them during initiation. And when she won an academic award a year later, he laminated the certificate before she could tell him not to. This is not a crime story. This is not exactly a love story either. It is the story of 2 people who built the most elaborate walls imaginable around themselves, and then had the absolute audacity to be surprised when the walls stopped working. It is also, genuinely, one of the funniest and most unexpectedly moving things you will hear today. Let's start at the document that started everything. The restraining order read as follows. Petitioner, Nia Washington. Respondent, Kwon Jae-hoon. Reason, in the petitioner's own words, the respondent visits my place of employment every night between 1:45 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. and engages in unsolicited conversation about his garden, his knees, and a documentary about penguins. He is not threatening. He is worse than threatening. He is relentless, and I have a dissertation to finish. The judge's signature sat at the bottom, and below it, in the margin, in different handwriting entirely, was a single annotation. It said, "Granted. Also, good luck. Before we go any further, there is something important to do. If you have ever built a wall around yourself and called it personality, if you have ever filed the emotional equivalent of a restraining order against something you actually wanted, if you have ever done something extraordinarily extra just to show someone you were paying attention, this story is for you. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Because this channel exists to find stories that are funny and true in the same breath. Stories about people who are ridiculous and human in equal measure. Stories that make you smile and actually mean it. This is one of those stories. Share it with whoever in your life would frame a restraining order. They know who they are. Now, 6 weeks before that restraining order was filed, a man who couldn't sleep walked into a diner at 2 a.m. and ordered eggs. Let's go back to the beginning. Nia Washington was 28 years old, and she was tired in the specific structural way that has nothing to do with sleep. She had grown up in Inglewood as the eldest of 4 siblings, which meant she had been the responsible one, the fixing one, the holding it together one, since before she was old enough to understand that not every child carried that particular weight. By the time she was a teenager, she had mastered the art of managing chaotic, unreasonable people without breaking stride. By the time she was 28, she had turned that skill into something close to a superpower and something even closer to a prison. She was working the night shift at a 24-hour diner in Leimert Park because the hours left the day free for her PhD research, and the tips were real money she could funnel quietly toward her mother's medical debt, without her mother knowing, because asking for help was a language Nia had never learned to speak and was not about to start learning now. She had a dissertation to finish on behavioral psychology. She had 3 younger siblings she checked in on every Sunday. She had a coffee order, black, no sugar, that she had maintained with the consistency of someone who had long ago decided that some things in life would simply be reliable, even if she had to be the one making them that way. She was not loud. She was not soft either. She occupied her space with a stillness that made unreasonable customers reconsider their choices before they had finished forming them. She wore bright earrings and bold lipstick like punctuation. Not for anyone else, but as a small daily declaration that she was still here, still herself, still choosing something beautiful in the middle of everything exhausting. She was, by any measure, extraordinary. She would have been the last person to say so. She was also, on the night in question, 45 minutes from the end of a double shift and in no mood for complications. The complication arrived at 1:47 a.m. and sat in booth 4. He was not what she expected, which was itself unexpected, because Nia Washington had seen everything the night shift in Los Angeles had to offer and was not easily surprised. But the man in booth 4 was different in a way that took her a moment to locate. He was young for what he clearly was, 34, maybe 35, with the kind of face that would have been entirely unremarkable if it weren't for the quality of attention it carried. Not handsome in the way that announces itself. Handsome in the way that you notice 3 minutes after the fact, when you are already walking away and something makes you reconsider. He had dark hair and sharp eyes and the particular stillness of someone who had learned very early that the person who moves least controls the room. He wore a suit that had no business being in a diner at 2 a.m., Not an old man's suit, not the suit of someone performing authority, but the suit of someone for whom authority was so internalized it no longer needed performance. He set his phone face down on the table when he sat. He looked at the menu for approximately 4 seconds before setting it down. "Decaf," he said when she approached. "Scrambled eggs. Please." She wrote it down. She brought it. She set it in front of him and turned to leave. "My collar," he said. "Is it crooked?" She looked. It was the left side sitting just slightly higher than the right, a small imperfection in an otherwise immaculate presentation. She told him so. She walked away. He straightened it. He ate his eggs in silence. He tipped $40 on a $14 meal, and he left at 2:52 a.m. without another word. He came back the next night, and the night after that. By the end of the first week, he had established a rhythm that Nia found mildly annoying and professionally interesting in equal measure. Decaf. Scrambled eggs. A brief observation, delivered not as conversation but as monologue, not requiring response, apparently not expecting one, and then comfortable silence until he left. The first week it was the weather. The second week it was his garden, specifically the tomatoes, specifically a recent setback involving too much direct sun and his own admitted impatience. The third week it was his knees, the left one primarily. His physiotherapist had given him specific instructions. He was not following them. He seemed entirely at peace with this. Nia served him. She said approximately 14 words across 4 weeks. He did not appear to require 14 words. He required, apparently, only the presence of someone who would bring him eggs without ceremony and tell him his collar was crooked and treat him, without fanfare or performance, like an ordinary person who had come in for breakfast at an unreasonable hour. She clocked what he was early on. She was not naive and she was not unobservant. She had seen enough of the world and read enough case studies to recognize the architecture immediately. Dominant personality, high control environment, deeply isolated, seeking the one thing that money cannot organize and power cannot manufacture, ordinary human contact. He was 34 years old and he had the specific loneliness of someone who had built something enormous before he had finished building himself, and the two projects had not ended up in the same place. She understood him with the clinical precision of someone who had spent 3 years reading people exactly like him. She understood him and she found him exhausting, and she found him, if she was being fully honest with herself, which she was not being, not yet, oddly compelling in the way that a problem you can see clearly is always more compelling than a problem you cannot. Week 4 he told her about the documentary, Penguins, a nature series. He had watched it on a Tuesday evening and had thoughts about it. He shared all of them. She refilled his coffee. She did not ask questions. He did not need questions. Week 5 he told her about his garden again. The tomatoes had recovered. He had adjusted the watering schedule. He said this with the quiet satisfaction of a man reporting a successful operation, and something about the way he said it, like this small domestic victory mattered deeply to him, like he had needed something to go right and the tomatoes had obliged, made Nia refill his coffee without being asked and walk away before she could examine why she had done it. Week 6 he told her about the Penguins again. A different segment. He had rewatched it. That night, after her shift, Nia Washington sat at her desk in her apartment in Inglewood, looked at her laptop, looked at the ceiling, and then opened a browser window and typed, Los Angeles Superior Court, Restraining Order, Filing Instructions. She was a behavioral psychologist. She recognized what she was doing. She was controlling the variable. She was establishing a boundary with clinical precision. She was absolutely not going to examine any other possible interpretation of this decision. She filed the paperwork on a Tuesday morning at 11:47 a.m. The judge read her stated reason, looked at her over his glasses for a moment that lasted slightly longer than necessary, and signed it. Good luck, he wrote in the margin, because 22 years on the bench had given him certain instincts, and every single one of them was telling him that this particular situation was far from over. The restraining order was served to Kwon Jae-hoon at his compound on a Thursday afternoon. He was seated at the head of a long table. 30 armed lieutenants were present. Business had been in progress. When the courier arrived with the legal envelope, there was a brief interruption, and then the document was placed in front of him and the room went very, very quiet. Jae-hoon read it. He read it again. He read it a third time. The room waited with the collective held breath of 30 people who understood, professionally speaking, that documents delivered to this address generally signified the beginning of something deeply unpleasant for whoever was named on them. Jae-hoon had received documents before. He had received documents that ended careers and documents that ended other things entirely. The room knew how he handled documents. The room was prepared for the handling. Then Jae-hoon looked up. His expression was not what anyone in the room expected. It was not anger. It was not calculation. It was not the particular focused stillness that preceded a decision nobody in the room would enjoy. It was something that Danny, his second-in-command, had never seen on his boss's face in 7 years of working alongside him. Something that had no place in this room, in this compound, in this life. Something that looked, if Danny was being fully honest with himself in a way that he would not be doing in public, uncomfortably close to moved. She thought about me, Jae-hoon said quietly. Enough to go to a courthouse. Danny felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately categorize and was not going to try to categorize in a room with 29 other people present. She filled out forms, Danny. Government forms. She thought about me with enough sustained intention to complete bureaucratic paperwork. Sir, Danny said, with the careful precision of a man choosing every word. She is asking you to leave her alone. Jae-hoon was quiet for a moment. He was 34 years old and he had built an empire from nothing, and he had never, in all of it, received a document from anyone who had simply sat and thought about him long enough to put it in writing. He pressed the restraining order flat on the desk with both hands, gently, the way you press a letter you have been waiting for. Get me a frame, he said. Sir. Gold. Brushed. Not shiny. Danny got the frame. He got it because after 7 years he understood that some instructions were not negotiable, and also because some part of him, the part that had been watching his boss eat breakfast at a diner alone every night for 6 weeks, understood something about this moment that the rest of the room did not. The frame was hung that evening in Jae-hoon's private office, between the portrait of his late mother and a signed photograph of himself shaking hands with a South Korean official. He was 34 years old and he stood back and looked at the framed restraining order and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something he did not have a word for yet, but that settled in his chest with the specific warm weight of significance. He would find the word eventually. It would take 2 more restraining orders, 1 custom display case with LED lighting, 1 academic conference, 1 intervention folder, 1 notarized letter, and 1 terms and conditions document with every section individually initialed. But he would find it. The most feared man on the West Coast stood in his office at 34 years old and felt seen for the first time. He had absolutely no idea how much it was going to cost him, or how completely worth it was going to be. The frame was hung that evening in Jae-hoon's private office, between the portrait of his late mother and a signed photograph of himself shaking hands with a South Korean official. He stepped back and looked at it for a long time. The room was quiet. Outside, Los Angeles hummed with its usual indifferent energy. Inside, the most feared man on the West Coast stood alone in his office and felt, for the first time in a very long time, seen. He did not examine this feeling. He was not yet equipped to examine it. He simply stood there with his hands at his sides and let it exist. She thought about me, he said again to nobody. Within the month, new recruits would be made to bow to it during initiation. Rival gangs, hearing that something was framed in the boss's office, something important enough to display between his mother and a government official, would assume it was a declaration of war. They would begin avoiding the diner entirely, giving it a wide berth out of fear of whatever powerful entity was clearly connected to the woman behind the counter. Nia's tips in the months that followed would be the best of her career. None of this was what she had in mind. None of it was, strictly speaking, her fault. The situation, however, had already become something significantly larger than a restraining order, and it was going to become larger still before it became anything resembling resolved. But before all of that, before the second restraining order and the third and the display case with the LED lights and the academic conference and the intervention folder and the flowers with the notarized letter, there was the first night. The real first night. Not the restraining order. The night 6 weeks before it, when Kwon Jae-hoon could not sleep and drove without a destination and found himself, At 1:47 a.m., standing outside a diner whose lights were still on. He had not eaten at a counter diner since he was 19 years old, arriving in Los Angeles with $200 and a cousin's address on a folded napkin, eating wherever the money could reach. He owned 12 restaurants now. He had not planned this. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking through the window at the fluorescent light inside, at the woman moving between tables with the focused economy of someone who had not stopped moving in 8 hours and was not about to start now, and something in him, something that the empire and the compound and the 15 years of carefully constructed untouchability had not managed to reach, decided to go in. He was 34 years old, and he had not done an unplanned thing in a very long time. She did not look up immediately when he sat down. When she did, she looked at him the way she looked at every customer at 2 a.m., with the efficient, impersonal attention of someone who needed to assess what you wanted so she could provide it and move on. She did not flinch at his stillness or his suit or the quality of his presence that usually made rooms recalibrate. She looked at him and said, with the energy of a woman who had 2 hours left in a shift, "What can I get you?" Not a question. A transaction. He ordered. She brought it. She noticed, without deciding to, that he took his coffee black with no sugar. She did not write this down. She simply knew it, the way the body knows things before the mind has organized them. She left him to his eggs and went back to her closing checklist and did not think about him for the rest of the night. Except she did once, and she noticed she did, and she filed it away under irrelevant and moved on. He tipped $40. He left without another word. And when he came back the following night and the night after that and every night for 6 weeks after that, Nia Washington served him with the same efficient, impersonal attention and did not ask questions and did not encourage conversation and did not, she told herself firmly, find any of this particularly interesting. She found all of it extremely interesting. She was not discussing this with anyone. The dissertation was the problem. She was 3 years into a PhD in behavioral psychology and her dissertation, titled, with the confidence of someone who had not yet met their subject, Emotional Fortress Architecture in Dominant Personality Types, had stalled. She had a theoretical framework she believed in. She had research. What she did not have, her academic advisor informed her with the gentle devastation of someone who was genuinely trying to help, was a real-world subject. Someone who actually lived the psychology she was theorizing about. Someone whose behavior illustrated the mechanisms she was describing. Someone she could study with enough access and consistency to produce findings that would hold up. You need someone who genuinely embodies the dynamic, her advisor said, sitting across from her in an office lined with books that had clearly been read rather than displayed. The theory is excellent, Nia, but theory without embodiment is just architecture without walls. You need the walls. Nia spent 11 days trying to find another subject. She interviewed 3 corporate executives who were technically high dominance but so thoroughly managed in their self-presentation that she couldn't get close enough to the actual psychology to study it. She contacted a retired military general who was fascinating but traveling internationally and could offer her 2 video calls and a questionnaire, which was not sufficient. She approached a megachurch pastor whose performance was extraordinary but whose fortress, on closer examination, was not architecture at all. It was theater, and theater was a different dissertation entirely. She came back to her advisor empty-handed on a Wednesday afternoon. Her advisor looked at her for a moment. "You have someone," she said. "No. Nia. No." She picked up her bag. "I'll keep looking." She kept looking for 3 more days. Then she walked into the diner on her day off, sat down across from Jae-hoon in booth 4, folded her hands on the table and explained, in precise clinical terms, the parameters of a strictly professional research arrangement. He would be anonymized as Subject K. There would be structured interviews. Professional distance would be maintained at all times. He would have the opportunity to review any material in which he appeared before publication. She watched his face while she spoke. He was 34 years old, and he listened with the complete, unhurried attention of someone who had learned before he was 20 that the person who listens longest controls the room. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes," immediately, without hesitation, with what she could only describe clinically as suspicious enthusiasm. She should have paid more attention to the suspicious enthusiasm. The first interview session was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Jae-hoon arrived 7 minutes early. He was wearing a different suit, equally expensive, slightly less formal, as though he had considered the setting and made a deliberate adjustment. He sat down across from her. He placed something on the table between them. It was a folder, typed, formatted, tabbed, with section headers. "What is that?" Nia said. "My preliminary notes," he said. "On my own psychological profile. I thought it would be useful to provide some structure for our sessions." She looked at the folder. She looked at him. "I provide the structure," she said. "You are the subject." "I am a collaborator," he said pleasantly. "There is a distinction." He explained, asked his second-in-command to research her foundational theoretical sources. He had found 2 of them questionable. He had prepared a rebuttal. 1 page, single-spaced, he said, sliding across what was clearly 6 pages, single-spaced with citations. Nia's left eye twitched. She would later identify this as the first time her left eye had ever twitched, and she would connect it, without difficulty, to this exact moment. "You are not here to critique my sources," she said. "I critique things that affect conclusions drawn about me," he said. "This seems reasonable." It was, she thought with deep irritation, slightly reasonable. She took the rebuttal. She did not tell him she would read it. She read it that night and found, with further deep irritation, that one of his 2 objections had merit. She restructured a footnote. She told no one. The interviews continued. They were not what she had designed them to be. What she had designed was a series of controlled exchanges in which she asked calibrated questions and he answered them and she observed the patterns. What actually happened was that Jae-hoon engaged with her questions with the precision of someone who had spent 15 years reading people and was now applying that precision to himself for the first time, out loud, for an audience of 1, with evident enjoyment. He was 34 years old and he was, as a research subject, both the most extraordinary person she had ever studied and completely, magnificently unmanageable. And then, 3 sessions in, he turned it around. "You take your coffee with no sugar," he said, at the beginning of what was supposed to be the 4th structured interview. She looked up from her notes. "You've been working this shift for at least 2 years, he continued, in the same measured tone he used for everything. "You are the eldest sibling, you have the specific attentiveness of someone who learned early to track the needs of people who weren't tracking their own. You haven't been in a relationship recently. Not because you don't want one. Because you don't have the bandwidth and you've decided it's simpler to call that a choice." The diner was quiet. "I am not your subject," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm curious anyway." She closed her notebook. She stood up. She said, "This session is over." "When is the next one?" he asked. "Never," she said. He nodded slowly. When she had gone, he took out his phone and opened his calendar and marked the following Thursday. He showed it to Danny that evening. "She said never," he said. "That means Thursday." Danny looked at the calendar entry. He looked at his boss, this 34-year-old man who had built an empire before most people his age had figured out what they wanted to do with their lives, who had the stillness of someone twice his age and the particular loneliness of someone who had moved so fast and so far that he had arrived somewhere vast and completely empty before he had noticed the journey was taking him away from everything ordinary and warm. Danny looked at all of this. He made a note in his phone under the title he had created 3 weeks earlier, "Things the boss has said that would ruin his reputation entirely." It was already 11 entries long. It was going to get much longer before this was over. The tip incident began simply enough, the way most escalations do, with a gesture that was meant to be kind and landed, instead like a declaration of war. Jae-hoon left $300 on a $14 meal. He placed it under his coffee cup with the practiced ease of someone who had been leaving extraordinary tips since he was 20 years old and first had money to leave. Back when leaving a large tip felt like proof of something. He put on his jacket. He left. Nia came to clear the table. She looked at the bills. She counted them. She picked them up, walked to the door, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and caught him just as he was reaching his car. "You left this," she said, holding out the money. He looked at it. He looked at her. "That's yours," he said. "It's $300. "Yes." The meal was $14. The service was exceptional. The service was standard. "Nia." He said her name the way he said everything, without drama, without performance, as though the word itself was simply a fact he was reporting. "Keep it." "No," she said, and held it out until he took it and went back inside. He left it again the next night, under the sugar dispenser this time, so she would find it after he had gone. She found it, put it in the fundraising jar the cook had set up for his kids' school trip, and said nothing about it the following evening. He found out 3 days later. He donated $10,000 to the school fundraiser in her name. Within a week, there was a new library reading corner being constructed at Jefferson Elementary School in Inglewood with a small engraved plaque on the wall that read, "In honor of Nia Washington." It was bolted to brick. It was, in every meaningful sense, permanent. She came to work the next morning and said nothing. He was in booth 4, completely serene, ordering eggs and decaf with the energy of a man who had done nothing unusual whatsoever and was prepared to maintain this position indefinitely. "The plaque has your name spelled correctly," he said, when she set his coffee down. "I checked 3 times. She looked at him for a long moment. She said nothing. She went to the coffee station. She made his coffee with decaf even though he had ordered regular. She brought it back. She set it down in front of him with the careful precision of someone setting down something that was not a cup of coffee. He drank it without comment. She switched it back the following night, gave him regular when he ordered decaf. He noticed within 2 sips. She watched him notice. His eyes moved to hers for just a moment. He said nothing. He looked back into his cup and smiled, very slightly, the way a person smiles when they realize they are in a chess match with someone whose game they genuinely respect. It was somehow worse than any response he could have given. It was the smile of a 34-year-old man who had been outmaneuvering people since he was 19 and had not, until now, met anyone who made the outmaneuvering feel interesting in both directions. The war continued for 6 weeks. He funded things. She redirected them. He redirected her redirections with the patience and strategic intelligence of someone who had built an empire before his 30th birthday and had never, in 15 years of professional life, lost a sustained campaign. She redirected his redirections with the stubbornness of a woman who had been solving problems alone since childhood and was not about to be outmaneuvered by a man with a checkbook, no matter how large the checkbook, no matter how precisely he seemed to understand exactly which problems needed solving. Then her mother's medical debt disappeared. She called the collections agency on a Tuesday morning to make her usual monthly payment. The voice on the other end told her the account was closed. Paid in full. She asked when. They told her. She asked by whom. They said they were not able to provide that information. She sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment building for 20 minutes. She sat very still and she stared at the windshield, and outside the morning went on being a morning. People walking dogs, a woman pushing a stroller, a man unlocking a laundromat, and inside the car Nia Washington sat with something moving through her chest that she identified, clinically, as a complex emotional response involving gratitude and fury, and something she was not going to name in a parking lot at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday because she was already late for the library and she had a dissertation to finish and she was absolutely fine. She was not fine. She drove to work. She served him eggs. She refilled his coffee. She said nothing. He said nothing. They did not look at each other for longer than was functionally necessary to conduct the transaction of a meal. The diner hummed around them. The other tables came and went. At 2:47 a.m. he left his usual tip, 20%, exactly as though he had measured it, and put on his jacket and said good night and left. Neither of them mentioned the debt. Ever. She filed the second restraining order 2 weeks later. It was broader than the first. More detailed. It had specific clauses about financial interference, third-party proxies, and this was the line the judge would read twice, slowly, with his glasses slightly lowered, acts of unsolicited generosity conducted at a distance. The judge looked at her over those glasses for considerably longer than he had the first time. She met his gaze without flinching. "He keeps framing them," she said. There was a pause. "He what?" the judge said. "He framed the first one," she said. "Hung it in his office, between a painting of his mother and a photograph with a government official." Another pause, longer than the first. "And you want me to give him another one?" the judge said. "I want him to stop," she said. The judge looked at her for another moment. He picked up his pen. He signed it. He also made a note to his clerk that afternoon. If a third one comes in from this petitioner, he said, put it on my desk personally. Jae-hoon received the second restraining order on a Thursday afternoon. He was 34 years old and he had received documents before. Documents that signified the end of alliances, the beginning of consequences, the closing of doors that would not reopen. He knew how to read a document. He read this one slowly, completely, with full attention. He read it 4 times. Then he set it down and sat with it for a moment, and then he called Danny into his office and held it up. She used the word disruptive, he said. His voice was not quite steady in a way that Danny clocked immediately and filed carefully. She finds me disruptive. Danny watched his boss, this man who had built an empire by 30, who had sat across tables from people twice his age and twice his size and never once shown them anything they could use, place a hand slowly over his own chest, the way someone does when they receive news they were not quite prepared for despite having been prepared for everything. Sir, Danny said, choosing his words with the care of a man defusing something. She is still asking you to leave her alone. She referenced specific incidents, Danny, in a legal document. She thought about specific things I did and wrote them down by date. He looked at the document again. She has been paying attention. She's building a case against you. She's been thinking about me. His voice had gone quiet. Not the dangerous quiet. A different quiet. The kind Danny had never heard before 7 months ago and was now beginning to recognize. Get me another frame. Sir. Brushed gold. Match the first one. Danny got the frame. The second frame matched the first exactly. Brushed gold. Not shiny. Jae-hoon hung them side by side and stood back and looked at them together with the focused assessment of someone hanging something that mattered, adjusting the spacing twice before he was satisfied. He called them the diptych, without irony, with the complete seriousness of a 34-year-old man who had decided that this was what they were and that was what he was calling them. He had the lighting above them adjusted. His interior decorator, who had standing instructions not to ask questions about the nature of documents being framed in this office, adjusted the lighting without asking questions. Nia found out about the diptych through a woman who did dry cleaning for one of the lieutenants. She received this information on a Wednesday evening standing in her kitchen eating cereal because she had not had time to cook. She processed it for approximately 30 seconds. She put down her bowl. She sat down at her desk. She filed a third restraining order. Purely out of spite. She would not have called it spite. She would have called it a proportionate and necessary legal response to a pattern of escalating behavior. It was spite. It was also, somewhere underneath the spite, something else that she was not examining, that she was in fact examining extensively in the privacy of her own mind and refusing to acknowledge she was examining, because she was Nia Washington and she had a dissertation to finish and she was absolutely not going to examine it. She filed the third restraining order and felt briefly better. Jae-hoon received it on a Friday morning. He read it with the same complete attention he gave everything. He called no one into his office. He simply sat with it for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called a craftsman he knew who did custom display cases for art collectors and told him he needed something in oak and glass. LED lighting along the inner edges, warm white, museum quality. He described the dimensions. He described exactly what it would hold. The craftsman asked what would be going in it. Documents, Jae-hoon said. Important ones. The case was installed the following week. Oak and glass. LED lighting along the inner edges, warm white, the kind used to illuminate irreplaceable things. It stood against the wall of his private office and held all 3 restraining orders and looked, to anyone entering the room for the first time, like the most bewildering trophy case in the history of organized crime on the West Coast. Danny looked at it for a long time on the morning it was installed. He added 3 new entries to the note in his phone. The academic conference arrived 6 weeks later like a collision Nia had no time to prepare for and would not have known how to prepare for anyway. She had been working on her presentation for 6 weeks. It was the most significant professional moment of her career to date. Her academic advisor would be there. Her academic rivals would be there. She had practiced until she could deliver it without notes, had refined every slide, had anticipated every possible question from every possible direction. She had not anticipated the fourth row. She was mid-slide. The title read Emotional Fortress Architecture in Dominant Personality Types, which was, in retrospect, its own kind of warning when she looked up from her notes to connect with the room and saw him. Kwon Jae-hoon, 34 years old, wearing a suit that cost more than the conference venue's daily rental fee. Sitting in the fourth row with perfect stillness and a notepad and a pen that was moving across the paper. He was taking notes. She stopped speaking for 3 full seconds. The room waited with the particular collective patience of academics who understood that pauses could be rhetorical. Nia found the stillness she had been building since she was a child, holding things together in Inglewood, and she used it now. She kept going. Because she was Nia Washington, and she had not spent 3 years on this research and 6 weeks on this presentation and gotten herself into this room to malfunction in front of her advisor and her rivals and everyone watching the only black woman presenting in the morning session. She kept going, and she was excellent, and she did not look at the fourth row again until the Q&A. During the Q&A, he raised his hand. She did not call on him. The session moderator, who did not know better, called on him instead. Jae-hoon's question was precise and respectful and built on the exact intersection of 2 ideas in her framework that she had herself been uncertain about and had hoped nobody would notice. It was so incisive that 2 professors in different parts of the room reached for their pens at the same moment. Her advisor, seated in the front row, raised an eyebrow that Nia saw and catalogued and filed under things to address later. She answered the question with everything she had and moved the session forward. After the session, her advisor found her in the hallway outside the presentation room. "Who was that man?" she asked. "Nobody," Nia said. "He asked the best question in the room, Nia." Her jaw tightened by a fraction. "I know," she said. "That's the problem." He found her at the conference coffee station 10 minutes later. He came up beside her quietly, the way he did everything, without announcement. He told her the paper was excellent. He said he had one small note. She told him flatly that she had not asked for notes. He took a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table next to her cup and walked away without another word. She did not read it. She told herself this on the train home. She was not going to read it. She had not asked for the note. She did not want the note. She was going to throw it away when she got home. She read it before the train reached the first stop. It was a single paragraph. Handwritten. Neat, precise handwriting that looked exactly like him. It identified, with complete and unhurried accuracy, the one gap in her argument that she had already known was there and had been hoping to paper over with confidence until she figured out how to close it properly. She stared at it past her stop, past the next one, past the one after that. She looked up when the conductor announced a station she did not recognize and realized she was 4 stops past where she needed to be, sitting on a train going the wrong direction, holding a folded piece of paper written by a 34-year-old crime boss who had apparently read her entire theoretical framework carefully enough to find the one thing she had not solved. She sat with the paper in her hands and the specific feeling of being seen so precisely that it was almost indistinguishable from being known. She went home. She restructured the second argument over the following 2 weeks. She told no one why. He did not mention it. She went to the courthouse the following week to file a 4th restraining order. She discovered at the clerk's window that the judge on her case had left a personal note. He would see her directly. She was shown to his office. He looked at her across his desk with the expression of a man who had been on the bench for 22 years and had seen most things and had not, until recently, seen this particular thing. "Still framing them?" he said. "Display case now," she said. "LED lighting." He was quiet for a moment. "How's the dissertation going?" he asked. She looked at the ceiling, then back at him. "It's going," she said. He did not sign a 4th restraining order. He told her, with the measured kindness of someone who had been watching people navigate impossible situations for 2 decades, that the existing orders were sufficient legal protection and that the situation might benefit from a different kind of approach. She thanked him. She went back to work. That night she served Jae-hoon his eggs and his coffee, and she thought about what the judge had said, and she thought about the handwritten paragraph, and she thought about her mother's medical debt that had disappeared on a Tuesday morning without explanation, and she thought, very carefully and for longer than she was going to admit, about a 34-year-old man who had learned how she takes her coffee on the very first night and had never once, in all the months since, mentioned it. Danny Kim had been Jae-hoon's second-in-command for 7 years. In that time he had negotiated peace agreements with people who did not believe in peace, managed the fallout from decisions that should never have been made, stood in rooms where the temperature dropped before anyone spoke, and maintained, through all of it, the composed steadiness of a man who understood that his job was to be the thing that did not break. He had a wife named Sarah who knew the broad outlines of his professional life and had made a deliberate choice not to know the details. He had 3 children who believed their father worked in business management, which was technically accurate. He went to his son's soccer games on Saturday mornings. He made a very good bibimbap. He was, in all the ways that mattered, a normal person who happened to work for the most feared man on the West Coast. He was also increasingly worried. It had started small. The framing of the first restraining order Danny had been able to categorize privately as an eccentricity. His boss had always been sentimental in ways that sat oddly against the professional profile. The journal he kept in the drawer of his reading chair, the koi pond he had installed himself during a week when business was quiet, the portrait of his late mother that hung in every room of the compound without exception. Jae-hoon was 34 years old, and he had built something that most men twice his age had not managed, and he had done it, Danny knew, by being simultaneously harder and stranger than anyone expected. The framing of a legal document was unusual. It was not, in the context of who Jae-hoon was, entirely inexplicable. Danny filed it mentally under things he would not mention to anyone and moved on. Then came the second frame, the diptych, the lighting adjustment. Then the display case, which Danny had stood in front of for a full minute on the morning it was installed, reading the 3 framed documents behind their museum-quality glass, and had then walked to his car and sat there without starting the engine for a while. Then the orchids appeared on the kitchen windowsill of the compound. The compound had never had plants. Danny had asked about them with the careful neutrality he applied to everything that confused him professionally. "I find them calming," Jae-hoon had said, with the complete composure of a man reporting a logistical decision. Danny had gone to his car again. Then his boss had cried at a paper towel commercial. Not wept, not broken down, nothing so legible as that. Just, the commercial had been playing on the television in the common room, one of those advertisements about a mother cleaning up after a child's birthday party, the kind of soft, warm, entirely unremarkable thing that plays between programs and that nobody watches. Danny had been walking past the doorway. He had glanced in. Jae-hoon was standing in front of the screen with his hands in his pockets and something in his expression that Danny had no category for. Something open and unguarded and very young. Something that had no business being on the face of a man whose name made people across 3 counties reconsider their plans. Danny had kept walking. He had kept walking because some things you do not stop for, not because they are not significant but because they are too significant, and because the man in that room was 34 years old and had the right to stand in his own common room and feel things without an audience. But that evening Danny had opened the note in his phone, the one he had titled, in a moment of private humor that had long since stopped feeling humorous, "Things the boss has said that would ruin his reputation entirely," and he had added a new section at the bottom. He labeled it simply, "Things the boss has done that I do not know how to process." The orchids made the list. The paper towel commercial made the list. The fact that Jae-hoon had begun referring to the koi in his pond by name, and had looked briefly, genuinely embarrassed when Danny overheard him doing it, and had then recovered his composure and said, with complete authority, "They respond better to individual address," made the list. The fact that he had rewatched the Penguin documentary made the list, because Danny had seen it in the viewing history and had not said anything and was not going to say anything and had added it to the list anyway because it needed to go somewhere. 2 of the organization's other senior members came to Danny separately, in the same week, with the same carefully worded concern. Something was different, they said. The boss was still sharp, still present, still made every decision with the speed and precision that had built the organization from nothing in 15 years. But there was something else. A loosening at the edges. A quality they could not name and did not know what to do with. Danny knew what it was. He had known for some time. He had been waiting to figure out what, if anything, was the appropriate response to it. He compiled the folder on a Sunday afternoon while Sarah took the kids to her mother's. He called it a psychological profile because that was the most accurate description of what it was. He included specific observed behaviors with dates, the most telling incidents in chronological order, and what he had identified as the 3 most significant data points. the paper towel commercial, the orchids, and the fact that 5 weeks ago on a Thursday night Jae-hoon had laughed, genuinely, physically, from somewhere real, at something a waitress had said about overcooked eggs, and Danny had not heard his boss laugh like that since before any of this, since back when Jae-hoon was 27 and had not yet become completely the thing he had been building himself into. He had not heard it in years. He took the folder to the diner on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. He sat down across from Nia Washington in the booth by the window, the one with the view of the street, and he placed the folder on the table between them and he waited. Nia looked at the folder. She looked at Danny. He had seen her a handful of times before from a distance across the diner, had observed the way she moved through the room with the economical authority of someone who had been managing difficult situations since long before this particular difficult situation arrived. She was, he thought, exactly as formidable as his boss's behavior suggested. "What is this?" she said. "A psychological profile," he said. "Of who?" He told her. She was quiet for a moment. A specific kind of quiet. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say, but the quiet of someone who was deciding very carefully what to say and what to leave unsaid. "Why are you bringing this to me?" she said. Danny folded his hands on the table. He had rehearsed this conversation 3 times on the drive over. "Because you are a psychologist," he said. "And because the man in that folder has not laughed. Actually laughed, the kind that starts in the shoulders, since before I can reasonably remember. 5 weeks ago he laughed at something you said about overcooked eggs. I have not seen him do that in years. I did not realize until that moment how long it had been." Nia looked out the window. The street was doing its ordinary afternoon things. She watched it for a moment. Her expression was not the expression of a woman who was unmoved. Danny had been reading people for a long time, and he knew the difference between someone who was not feeling something and someone who was feeling something and was managing it with every tool available to them. "I have 3 restraining orders," she said. "He has them in a display case," Danny said, "with LED lighting. We believe it is making things worse. That is not my problem. Ms. Washington." He kept his voice even. "That man is 34 years old, and he has spent 15 years building something that required him to be unreachable. He became unreachable. He did it completely. And somewhere in the process of doing it completely he became unreachable to himself as well, and he is only now beginning to understand what that cost." He paused. "He gives to people around him because it is the only form of closeness that his world ever taught him was safe. He has the paperwork framed because it is the only language he has for what he is feeling. He does not yet have better language. He is trying to find it." Nia looked at the folder on the table between them. She did not touch it. "He laughed with his shoulders," Danny said quietly, "because of something you said. He did not even know he was doing it." The diner hummed around them. Someone at the counter ordered coffee. The cook said something through the window and Bria laughed at whatever it was. "He has the paperwork framed like it is a gift," Danny said. "You study this. You know what that means." He stood. He straightened his jacket with the small precise gesture that was simply part of how he moved through the world. He picked up the folder. "I am not asking you to fix him," he said. "I am not asking you to feel anything you do not feel. I am asking you to know that you matter to him in a way he does not yet have words for." He met her eyes directly. "He is 34 years old and he is working on the words. That is not nothing." He left. Nia sat in the booth for a long time after he was gone. She refilled her own coffee from the station and came back and sat down again. She looked at the wall. She thought about the folder and the display case and the shoulder laugh and the orchids she had not known about until just now and the penguin documentary she had not known about until just now, and all of it adding up to something she had been studiously not adding up for months. She thought about her dissertation. She thought about the theoretical framework she had constructed around people who built fortresses and the mechanisms by which they maintained them and the specific clinical language she had developed for describing what happened when those mechanisms began to fail. She thought about how she had written extensively and carefully about people who used provision as a substitute for vulnerability and had not written a single word, not one, about people who used control as a substitute for safety. She thought about who that omission described. She closed out her tables. She went home. She opened her dissertation on her laptop and sat in front of it without writing anything. Then she navigated to the dedication page, which had been blank for 3 years, and she looked at it for a while. She closed the laptop. She went to bed. She did not sleep for some time. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in a therapy office in Silver Lake with good lighting and a plant that was thriving in the corner window, Jae-hoon sat across from a woman named Dr. Park who had a 4-month waitlist and an unflinching quality that he had recognized and respected from the first session. She had agreed to see him as a favor to someone who owed him something, which she had noted during that first session was itself a data point worth examining. The fact that even accessing help had to be routed through the machinery of obligation rather than simply asked for. He had respected that too. Reluctantly, "Let me make sure I understand the timeline," she said, looking at her notes with the focused attention of someone who took timelines seriously. "She filed a restraining order. You had it framed." "Correct." "She filed a second one. You had them framed together. As a set." "A diptych, yes." "She filed a third. Display case. Custom built. Oaken glass. LED lighting along the inner edges. Warm white, the kind they use in museums." Dr. Park wrote something down. He tried to read it upside down. He could not read it. He had tried at every session. He had not succeeded at any of them, which he found mildly interesting from a professional standpoint and personally somewhat frustrating. She looked up at him over her pen. "Jae-hoon," she said, with the composure of a woman who had heard a great many things over 11 years of practice and had believed, until approximately 4 sessions ago, that she had reached the outer boundary of what could surprise her. "What exactly do you believe a restraining order is?" He considered this question the way he considered everything, completely without rushing toward an answer before he had found the right one. "Evidence," he said, "that I occupy space in her mind." The office was quiet for a moment. "That is," Dr. Park said carefully, setting her pen down, "one of the most romantically delusional things I have heard in 11 years of practice." He nodded. He received this without defensiveness, in the way he received most things he had decided to receive, completely without performance. "And also," she added, and she said it the way someone says something that surprised them by being true, somehow not entirely wrong. She picked her pen back up. She wrote something. He was fairly certain it said, "Increase sessions to weekly." It did. She told him 3 things before he left that session. The first was that he had, in her professional assessment, the emotional vocabulary of a decorative gourd, and that this was not a permanent condition but it was going to require sustained effort to change. The second was that the framing was displacement behavior, a way of honoring something real without risking the exposure that honoring it directly would require, and that he knew what displacement behavior was and he needed to stop doing it. The third thing was the one that stayed with him on the drive back to the compound, that he turned over in his mind while he sat in the private sitting room watching the koi move in the pond. "You cannot romance someone through the court system, Jae-hoon," she had said. "You are 34 years old. At some point you are going to have to use your words, your actual words, out loud, to her face." He sat with this for 4 days. Then he began preparing exactly what words to use. It was 2 a.m. on a Wednesday and the diner was empty and Nia was working her way through the closing checklist with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been closing this diner for 2 years and could do it in her sleep. She was counting the register. She was thinking about her dissertation. She was thinking about Danny's visit 3 weeks ago and what he had said about the shoulders and the years, and she was not, she told herself, thinking about booth 4. She looked up. Jae-hoon was still there. He had been quiet for the last hour, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he was not eating. He was not talking. He was sitting with both hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold 40 minutes ago, and he was looking at the table and he was doing the thing that Nia recognized, from 3 years of clinical training, as the specific quality of stillness that was not peace but its opposite, the stillness of someone sitting very quietly inside something very loud. She should have told him they were closed. She walked over to booth 4 and she sat down across from him. She did not know why. She would think about this later, at length, and she would not arrive at a satisfying clinical explanation, because the honest explanation was not clinical. The honest explanation was that she had been watching this man sit alone for 2 years, and something in her that was not her psychology training and was not her professional judgment and was not her carefully maintained sense of appropriate distance had simply had enough of watching it. She sat down and she looked at him and she asked, not clinically, not carefully, not with professional distance maintaining itself between them like a wall. She asked what exactly he was doing. Not at the diner. Here. In this version of his life where he framed legal documents and cried at commercials and had his staff compile therapy folders about him. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the hum of the diner settled around them like something alive. Long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "You talk to me like I'm a person." 3 words she had not prepared for. The simplest sentence. He said it the way he said everything, without drama, without performance. And it landed in the quiet of the empty diner with the weight of something that had been true for a long time and had not been said out loud before now. Not a boss. Not a name that meant something dangerous. Not someone to be managed or feared or impressed. Just a person. Sitting in a booth. Who ordered the same thing every night because the same thing was what you ordered when you had run out of reasons to vary. Nia looked at her coffee. She did not have a sharp response. She found, to her own mild alarm, that she did not want one. He looked at her then, directly, steadily, with the precision of someone who had spent 15 years reading people and was now turning that same precision entirely on one person, without agenda, without strategy, just because he wanted to see her clearly. "Why do you keep letting me come back?" he said. "You are not a woman who does things she doesn't want to do. I have watched you for 2 years. You file paperwork. You redirect tips. You left my conference note on read for 2 weeks before restructuring your second argument." He paused. "You know exactly what I am. You could have had me removed on the first night." Her eyes narrowed. "I didn't restructure." 3rd chapter. 2nd argument. The methodological gap. He was not smug about it. He was simply certain, in the way he was certain about everything he had paid close enough attention to. "You fixed it. You know you did." She said nothing. "So why didn't you have me removed?" he said. The refrigerator cycled. Somewhere outside on the street a car passed slowly and the headlights moved across the window and were gone. The diner hummed around them with its particular 2 a.m. frequency, that low, steady, fluorescent sound that belonged to no time of day and every time of day simultaneously. Nia looked at this man across a laminate table at 2 a.m., this ridiculous, sentimental, terrifying, genuinely lonely man with his cold coffee and his koi pond and his LED-lit display case and his decorative gourd emotional vocabulary that he was apparently, according to Dr. Park, actively working on, and she found the one true thing she had been not saying for 2 years and she said it. "Because you remembered I take my coffee with no sugar," she said. "First night. I never told you. You just noticed." He blinked. It was the first time in 2 years that she had seen him not know what to say. Not searching for the right response, not composing himself, not doing any of the practiced, elegant management of reaction that she had watched him deploy in every other situation. Just still. Genuinely, openly still. Like someone who had been handed something they had not known they were waiting for and needed a moment to hold it. She stood up. She collected his cup. She started turning off the lights at the back of the diner, moving through the familiar routine of closing, and she said, without looking at him, "We're closed." And then, after a pause that she felt somewhere between her ribs, "Same time tomorrow." He sat in the dark for a moment after she went to the back. Not because he was sad. Because he was sitting with something he wanted to keep, the way you keep the last of something good. Not out of sadness that it was ending but out of gratitude that it had happened at all. He left. He drove back to the compound through empty Los Angeles streets, the city quiet in the way it was only ever quiet between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., when it forgot briefly to be difficult. He sat in the private sitting room by the koi pond and he did not journal and he did not think about the empire and he did not think about tomorrow's business. He thought about 3 words. You just noticed. He thought about what it meant to be noticed. He thought about years of being watched, by rivals, by lieutenants, by the world, and never once being simply noticed, the way you notice something quiet and ordinary and true, without agenda, without purpose, just because it was worth noticing. He went to bed late. He was smiling. He asked Danny the next morning how people did this. How they went about asking someone to dinner. Like a normal person. With words. Danny looked at his boss for a long moment with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this question and was going to answer it as simply as possible because simple was clearly what was needed here. You say the words, he said. With your mouth. You ask her if she would like to have dinner with you. I know how communication works, Danny. Danny looked at him steadily. Do you though? Jae-hoon spent 4 days preparing. He wrote 7 drafts of what he intended to say. He had 2 of his lieutenants read the drafts anonymously without context. One of the lieutenants cried reading the 5th draft, quietly, privately, at his desk, and was sent immediately from the room and was not allowed to speak of it. Jae-hoon researched, with the methodical thoroughness he applied to everything, the appropriate protocols for requesting dinner when there were 3 active restraining orders in play. He found, disappointingly, very little useful literature on the subject. He sent flowers. Once. 12 stems. White. Tasteful. A card that said simply, I would like to take you to dinner. As a person. Not a subject. K. The flowers arrived with a notarized letter confirming his identity because he had been genuinely concerned about ambiguity, and this had seemed like the most efficient solution to the ambiguity. Nia stared at the arrangement on the diner counter for 45 minutes between tables. Bria, the other waitress, leaned over and looked at the notarized letter and then looked at Nia with an expression that contained an entire conversation. Girl, Bria said. Don't, Nia said. He notarized. I said don't. She took the flowers home that evening. She told herself it was because throwing them away was wasteful and she had been raised not to waste things. She put them on her desk, next to her dissertation. She straightened them twice before she left the room. She did not examine this. She went to bed and did not think about the placement of flowers on a desk next to a dissertation dedicated to a man who had just sent her notarized confirmation that flowers were from him. She thought about it extensively. She did not acknowledge that she was thinking about it. The next evening she came to work with a folded piece of paper. She set it on the table in front of Jae-hoon while she refilled his coffee. He was holding his cup with both hands and sitting, she noticed, approximately 1 inch straighter than usual, which on him looked like a man bracing for the kind of sentencing he had decided in advance to accept without argument. He opened the paper. It was a document, typed, formatted, with section headers. Terms and conditions for 1 dinner. Proposed by Nia Washington. Submitted to K. Jae-hoon, subject K. She had written 6 sections. Section 1 covered venue. She would choose it. It could not be anywhere he owned or had ever visited or could arrange in advance. It needed to be a normal restaurant with normal lighting that did not go mysteriously quiet when he entered. Section 2 covered security. Danny could park outside but could not come in, could not stand near a window in a visible way, could not make eye contact with the server. Section 3 covered conversation, no dissertation discussion, no prepared notes, no questions that had clearly been researched in advance, and if he brought index cards she was leaving immediately. Section 4 covered the bill, they would split it evenly, and if he tipped more than 20% she would calculate the difference and mail him a check. Section 5 covered conduct, 1 dinner, nothing decided, nothing resolved, just 2 people eating food like normal human beings who had chosen to eat food together. Section 6 said, the display case. The restraining orders come down. He read every word. He read it the way he read everything important. Completely, without skipping. He looked up when he reached the end. His eyes moved to section 6 and stayed there for a moment longer than the other sections. Those were, he started. I know what they were, she said. Something shifted in his expression. It was not dramatic. It was not visible to anyone who had not been watching him as carefully as she had been watching him for 2 years. But she had been watching him that carefully and she saw it. Something releasing, something that had been held in place by long habit and longer necessity finally, quietly letting go. Like a hand unclenching after holding something very tightly for a very long time. Agreed, he said. All terms. He produced a pen from his jacket, a beautiful pen, the kind that had no business being in a diner and that he apparently carried as a matter of course because he was exactly who he was, and signed the bottom of the document. Then he went back through it from the beginning and initialed every section individually, with the careful attention of someone who wanted each initial to mean something. She picked it up. She looked at the initials. She looked at him, You initialed every section, she said. I wanted to demonstrate thorough review, he said. She walked away before her face could do something she had not given it permission to do. She made it to the coffee station before she allowed herself one small moment of something that was not a smile and also completely was, and then she put it away and went back to work. The dinner was at a small Ethiopian restaurant in Leimert Park that Nia had been going to since her undergraduate years. It was warm and loud, and the lighting was amber and honest, and the injera was perfect, and absolutely nobody in the room cared who anyone was. It was, in every way that mattered, exactly the right place. Jae-hoon arrived before her. He was wearing a dark jacket without a tie, which for him was the sartorial equivalent of showing up in pajamas, and he stood when she arrived even though she told him he didn't have to. You don't have to do that, she said. He did it anyway, with the simple, unperformative courtesy of someone who stood because it was the right thing to do and had never needed an audience for the right thing. She was wearing a green dress and her good earrings. He noticed. He said nothing. She noticed that he noticed and said nothing. They sat down inside a small silence that was extremely loud in the way that silences are loud when they are full of things both people are choosing not to say yet. The first 10 minutes were careful. Two people handling something fragile, moving around it slowly, speaking politely about small things. The restaurant noise wrapped around them like a buffer, and they were grateful for it. Then the food arrived, and she told him he was tearing the injera wrong, and he said he had been eating with his hands since he was a child, and she said it clearly had not helped, and he laughed. Really laughed. The shoulder kind. The kind Danny had not seen in years. The kind that started somewhere genuine and moved upward through his whole chest and came out unmanaged and unperformed and completely real. The sound of it surprised her. The sound of it surprised him. And something in the dinner unlocked, the way things unlock when two people simultaneously stop pretending. Like a door that had been closed so long everyone had forgotten it could open, and then one day it simply did. They talked. Not diner talk. Not dissertation talk. Not the careful, managed exchange of two people maintaining appropriate distance. He told her about arriving in Los Angeles as a teenager with $200 and a cousin's address written on a napkin and the specific, uncomplicated certainty that he would either build something from nothing or disappear in the attempt, and that both outcomes had seemed equally possible and equally fine. She told him about her mother's diagnosis and the night she had sat at the kitchen table with the medical bills spread out in front of her and felt the floor shift and decided, without consulting anyone, that she would fix it herself, because she did not know how to ask for help and she was not going to start learning on the worst night of the year. He told her the truest thing he had said out loud in longer than he could accurately remember. That he had built something enormous and in doing so had made himself completely unreachable, and that he had not understood what was happening until it had already happened entirely, until he was already inside the walls and the walls were finished and very solid and very high, and the only person who had ever simply walked up to them without flinching, without adjusting her behavior, without performing anything at all, was a woman who worked the night shift at a diner and brought him eggs without ceremony and told him his collar was crooked. She was quiet for a moment. That's the most self-aware thing you've ever said, she told him. I've been in therapy, he said. She looked at him. Since when? Since Danny showed me the intervention folder and I realized my own staff had compiled a psychological profile of me out of concern for my well-being. A pause. My therapist told me in our first session that I had the emotional vocabulary of a decorative gourd. Nia pressed her lips together. Very hard. The effort was visible and valiant and entirely unsuccessful. You are not allowed to laugh, he said with complete dignity. I am in the middle of significant personal growth. She laughed until her eyes watered. Not politely, not carefully, completely with her whole face, the way she laughed when nobody was watching, and he watched her do it and he did not hide what he felt watching it. He did not look away. He did not manage his expression into something more appropriate. He simply looked at her the way you look at something you have been allowed to have after a long time of not being allowed to have anything like it. Stop, she said, catching him, still laughing. No, he said simply. After dinner they walked. The night was warm. Los Angeles in that brief, tender hour when it forgets to be difficult. When the traffic is gone and the air has cooled and the city is just streets and lights and the sound of two people walking on a sidewalk without a destination. She told him 3 times during the walk that this did not mean anything had been decided. Each time he agreed with exactly the same expression. patient, warm, completely and serenely unconvinced. And each time it was somehow more infuriating than disagreement would have been. It was the expression of someone who had already decided something and was too well-mannered to say so and too honest to pretend otherwise. "You're doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "Where you agree with me but your face is saying something entirely different." "I have a neutral face." Jae-hoon. His name. Without clinical distance. Without any of the careful framing she usually placed around it. Just his name, said the way you say the name of someone who has become real to you in a way that is no longer manageable or deniable. They stopped walking. They were standing outside a bookstore whose window lights were still on. The books arranged in the glass like quiet witnesses to whatever was happening on the sidewalk outside. He turned to face her. He said, "I am not a project. I know I started as one. I know I framed the paperwork which is, in retrospect, not the behavior of a stable individual. It was unhinged," she confirmed. "Completely. But I need you to know that whatever this is, I am aware of what I feel. I have been aware of it for some time. My therapist suggested I simply tell you directly and stop outsourcing my communication to legal documents." Nia looked at him. "Your therapist said that." She said specifically, "Jae-hoon, you cannot romance someone through the court system." Those were her exact words. "She sounds incredible. She has a 4-month waitlist. I got in because someone owed me a favor, which she also pointed out was itself a data point worth examining." He said this without any apparent irony about the irony. Nia stood on the sidewalk outside the bookstore and looked at this man. This reformed, genuinely trying, completely unhinged in the most specific and particular way man who had framed her restraining orders and cried at a paper towel commercial and had his staff compile an intervention folder and was now standing in Leimert Park at midnight telling her verbatim what his therapist said about the court system. "One more dinner," she said. His whole face did something quiet and enormous that he did not try to contain. "I have terms," she added immediately. "Of course you do. I'm serious. I know. Send them to my personal email. I will initial every section. Don't make it a thing. It is already a thing. Good night, Jae-hoon." "Good night, Nia." He watched her walk to her car. He watched until she was inside and the engine turned over and the headlights came on and she pulled out of the space and was gone down the street. She did not tell him to stop watching. She did not want him to. She drove home through empty Los Angeles and she was smiling before she reached the end of the block and she did not try to stop because there was nobody in the car and some things, she was slowly learning, did not need to be managed. Danny arrived at the compound the next morning at 7:30 and found the display case empty. He stood in front of it for a moment. The oak and glass case with the LED lighting along the inner edges was there, intact, exactly where it had always been. But the 3 restraining orders were gone. He went to the hallway. He checked the office. He walked through 3 rooms before he found them. They were in the private sitting room. The personal one, off the library, where no meetings happened and no business was conducted. The room with the reading chair and the koi pond visible through the window and the side table where the journal sat. The room that was only ever Jae-hoon, alone, with the quiet parts of himself that the empire did not reach. The 3 restraining orders were there. Still framed, still lit. He had moved a small lamp from the corner to illuminate them. But they had been rearranged, spread slightly apart, and between them, in a new frame that matched the others exactly, was something else. A folded piece of paper. The terms and conditions document. Her neat, precise signature at the bottom and his initials in every section, tiny and careful, one per clause, demonstrating thorough review. Danny stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment. He looked at the frames. He looked at the koi pond where the fish moved slowly in the early morning light, named after people worth naming things after. He looked at the journal on the side table, which was closed but had a pen resting across the top of it, which meant it had been used recently, which meant something had happened that was worth writing down. He went back to the kitchen. Jae-hoon was making coffee. He was in a dark sweater, no jacket, moving around the kitchen with the unhurried ease of a man who had slept well and was not in a hurry about anything and was at peace, in this particular morning, with both of those things. "Where are they?" Danny said. "I moved them." Danny waited. "The sitting room," Jae-hoon said. pouring the coffee with the same focused attention he gave everything. They belong there now. Danny processed this. He looked at his boss, at the set of his shoulders, at the quality of his stillness, which was different this morning in a way Danny was only now finding the language for. It was not the stillness of someone holding something at bay. It was the stillness of someone who had put something down. "How was dinner?" Danny said. Jae-hoon was quiet for a moment. He set the cup down. He looked out the kitchen window at the compound grounds, at the morning doing its ordinary morning things outside. "She let me walk her to her car," he said. Danny had maintained composure in negotiations on 4 continents. He had stood in rooms where a single wrong word could end things permanently. He had managed, over 7 years, every variety of difficult and impossible situation that his professional life had produced, and he had done all of it with the steady, reliable professionalism of someone who had decided early that his job was to be the thing that did not break regardless of what was breaking around it. He left the room. He stood in the hallway outside the kitchen and he celebrated. Not loudly, not dramatically, just 30 seconds of contained, genuine, private joy, the specific joy of a man who had been carrying a worry for 2 years and had just been relieved of it, and then he straightened his jacket with the small, precise gesture that was simply part of how he moved through the world, and he went back to work. Across the city, Nia woke up in her apartment in Inglewood and looked at the ceiling. The morning was gray and warm, and the apartment was quiet in the way it is quiet after you have been somewhere that mattered and come home changed in a way you have not yet fully measured. She lay there for a moment. She thought about the dinner, the injera argument, the shoulder laugh that had surprised both of them, the bookstore with its window lights still on, the initials in every section, tiny and careful, 1 per clause. She thought about what it felt like to be looked at by someone who was not managing you or performing for you or afraid of you. Someone who was simply looking at you plainly and without agenda, because you were worth looking at. She got up. She made coffee. She sat at her desk and opened her dissertation and navigated to the dedication page. She had written it 3 months ago on a night when she was tired enough to be honest. The specific honesty that tiredness sometimes produces when the usual defenses have gone to bed before the rest of you. She read it now, to Subject K, who turned out to be a much more cooperative research partner than anticipated, and to the Los Angeles County Court system, without whose paperwork none of this would have been possible. She read it twice. She closed the document. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She picked it up again. She looked at it for a moment. Then she typed 7 words and sent them before she could organize a single reason not to. The terms for dinner too. Check your email. She put the phone face down on the desk. She looked at the dissertation. She looked at the flowers on the corner of the desk. Still in their vase, still white, a little past their best now, petals beginning to soften at the edges, but still there because she had not thrown them away, and she had told herself it was because waste was irresponsible, and she was going to keep telling herself that for as long as it was useful. She picked up the phone after 30 seconds. 3 dots appeared. He was typing. The dots stopped. An email arrived. Subject line, terms for dinner too. She opened it. Every section initialed. Thorough review demonstrated, as promised, as she had known it would be. And at the bottom of the email, below the initial document, in the same formal structure as the original terms and conditions, was a postscript. Amendment A, proposed by Kwon Jae-hoon. Section 2, Security. Danny may come inside if it is cold. He has a bad back. This is non-negotiable. I await your counterproposal. Nia stared at the screen. She thought about Danny. She thought about him sitting across from her in the booth by the window with the folder on the table between them, and his hands folded with the patience of a man who had prepared carefully for a conversation he was not sure would go well. She thought about what he had said about the shoulders. She thought about him standing up and straightening his jacket and picking up the folder and walking away, leaving her with her coffee and her wall and the particular weight of having been told a true thing she had not asked to be told. She typed 3 words. Danny comes inside. She sent it. She closed the laptop. She sat for a moment in the quiet of her apartment with the flowers on the corner of the desk and the coffee cooling in her cup and the morning doing its gentle, unremarkable things outside the window, and she sat with the specific feeling of someone who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time. Holding it with both hands, with everything, the way you hold something you are afraid of losing or afraid of having, and has just quietly in a kitchen at 8 a.m. on an ordinary morning let it go. She did not examine this feeling. She had examined enough things. She got up and went to get ready for the day. 1 year later, Nia Washington's dissertation was published. It was titled Emotional Fortress Architecture and the Conditions of Voluntary Dismantlement, a longitudinal study of high-dominance personalities. It won a regional academic award. The award dinner was held at a hotel in downtown Los Angeles with white tablecloths and warm lighting and the pleasant, self-congratulatory hum of a room full of people who were pleased with themselves and with each other. Jae-hoon was seated next to her academic advisor. He was wearing a dark suit and was, as always, immaculately still and entirely at ease in rooms that were designed to impress people, which was itself a form of impressiveness that such rooms never anticipated. Her advisor, who was a brilliant woman and an exceptional reader of research, spent the first 40 minutes of the dinner trying to determine who this man was. He was charming without effort. He was complimentary about Nia's work in ways that made clear he had read it carefully and engaged with it seriously. He mentioned at one point, with complete casualness, that he had been tangentially involved in the research. Her advisor looked at him with the focused attention of someone connecting dots that were beginning to form a picture she had not expected. "In what capacity?" she asked. He smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that knew something and was not in a hurry to say it. "Case study," he said. Across the table, Nia closed her eyes. She kept them closed for approximately 3 seconds, which was all the time she had allocated for this particular response. She opened them and looked at Jae-hoon, and he was looking back at her with an expression that was patient and warm and completely, serenely unrepentant, and she shook her head very slightly and he inclined his very slightly in return, and something passed between them across the white tablecloth and the good lighting that her academic advisor witnessed and would think about for some time afterward without quite being able to put it into the right words. The dissertation's dedication page had been printed in the evening's program. Several people read it and found it curious in ways they could not explain. One person, the judge who had signed all 3 restraining orders and who had come to the dinner because his wife sat on the award committee, read it and laughed quietly to himself and showed it to his wife, who asked what was funny, and he said he would explain later. He did explain later. She also laughed. Back at the compound that night, in the private sitting room off the library, the display case held 4 frames. The 3 restraining orders. The terms and conditions document with its neat signature and its careful initials. And now, newest edition, installed the previous evening before the dinner, the award certificate itself, laminated first before anything else, because some things you preserve before anyone can tell you not to, in a frame that matched the others exactly, lit by the same warm lamp, visible from the reading chair. Danny saw it the next morning. He stood in the doorway of the sitting room and looked at the 4 frames and the warm light falling across all of them equally, and he said nothing. He had stopped being surprised some time ago. He had not, however, stopped adding to the note in his phone. The note was 48 entries long. Entry 48 was the last one. It had no date. It said, "He laughed today. The shoulder kind." I did not write down what she said. Some things you just keep. Outside, Los Angeles was doing what it does in the early morning, forgetting briefly to be difficult. 2 people on opposite sides of the city were making coffee. Neither of them was alone anymore. Neither of them said this out loud. They did not need to. And this is where the story of Nia Washington and Kwon Jae-hoon ends. With coffee and morning light and a display case with LED lighting and a woman who stopped trying to throw away flowers that had been placed too deliberately next to things that mattered. But a story is only worth telling if it leaves you with something worth carrying. And this one carries several things. The first is this: the walls we build to protect ourselves are always built for good reasons. Nia built hers from the accumulated weight of being the one who holds things together, the fixer, the eldest, the one who cannot afford to need because needing has always cost more than she had to spend. Jae-hoon built his from a world in which being reachable was the same as being vulnerable, and being vulnerable was the same as being exposed. Both of their walls made complete, logical, entirely reasonable sense. Both of their walls were also, quietly and steadily, making them unreachable to the thing they most needed. The lesson is not that walls are wrong. The lesson is that walls were never meant to be permanent. They are for seasons, not lifetimes. And the hardest, bravest thing a person can do is recognize when the season has changed and take the door off the hinges. The second is this: the most intimate act between two people is not passion or proximity. It is attention. The kind that does not announce itself or ask for acknowledgement. The kind that simply accumulates quietly over many nights, noting the small true things: no sugar, the left knee, the collar that sits slightly crooked, and storing them not as leverage, not as performance, but simply because the person is worth noticing. Jae-hoon's language was wrong for most of this story. The tips and the frames and the display case were the right feeling expressed in entirely the wrong form. But underneath every misapplied gesture was the same consistent, unhurried truth. He was paying attention. And Nia, who had spent her entire adult life not being paid attention to in ways that cost her nothing, recognized it immediately. She did not know what to do with it. She filed paperwork. But she recognized it. And recognition, in the end, is always where everything begins. The third is this: real love, the unglamorous, legally documented, dissertation-derailing kind, does not ask you to stop being who you are. It asks you to be more completely who you are. Jae-hoon did not stop being precise and deliberate and slightly excessive in everything he did. He learned to aim it differently. Nia did not stop being structured and self-sufficient and in possession of strong opinions about injera technique. She learned to let those things coexist with someone else in the room. They did not fix each other. They did not rescue each other. They simply, stubbornly kept showing up, in booths and courthouses and conference rooms and Ethiopian restaurants in Limerick Park, until showing up became the thing they did together instead of separately. The fourth, and perhaps the most important, is this: you cannot romance someone through the court system. This is true. It has been confirmed by a licensed therapist with an 11-year practice and a 4-month waitlist. However, and this is the part Dr. Park did not say out loud but which the story says clearly, the desire behind the framing was never wrong. The desire to say you matter enough to preserve, you are significant enough to honor, you occupy space in my life that I want to mark with something permanent, that desire is not wrong. It simply required, in this particular case, a better delivery mechanism than a custom-built oak and glass display case with warm white LED lighting. The mechanism, eventually, was a sentence said plainly at 2 a.m. in an empty diner under fluorescent lights with a refrigerator cycling in the background. You talk to me like I'm a person. Simple. Unglamorous. Completely true. The right words do not need frames. They do not need laminating. They just need to be said, out loud, to the right person, before it is too late to say them. And finally, some things should be earned. The ending of this story is warm because the people in it worked for it. Not heroically, not perfectly, but consistently and honestly with everything they had, which was considerable. Two people with fortress walls and no vocabulary for what they were feeling, and a combined total of 3 restraining orders and 1 custom display case managed, over 2 years of eggs and cold coffee and 1 very patient second in command, to learn something about themselves that they had spent their whole lives carefully not learning. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. The restraining orders stayed on the wall. Not as trophies anymore. As the world's most legally unusual love letters. From a man who did not know how to say "I see you" any other way. Until he did. And on the wall beside them, in matching frames with the same warm light falling across all of them equally. A terms and conditions document with every section initialed, and 1 award certificate laminated first, obviously, because some things you preserve before anyone can tell you not to. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If you made it here, you already know what kind of person you are. You are someone who believes that the funny parts and the true parts are the same parts, and that a man who frames a restraining order and a woman who writes terms and conditions for dinner are both, underneath all of it, just people trying to figure out how to let something matter. That is all any of us are doing, every day, with varying degrees of success and documentation. This channel exists for exactly these kinds of stories, the ones that make you smile and mean it, that stay with you past the last word, that you find yourself thinking about 3 days later when you are making coffee and you remember Danny straightening his jacket in the hallway and celebrating alone for 30 seconds because his boss laughed with his shoulders. If this story was that story for you, subscribe, share it with someone who needs it, and leave a comment with 1 word. Just 1 word that describes how you would have handled Booth 4. The answer, whatever it is, says everything. Same time tomorrow.